Good morning, my name is Alex Smith. I have the privilege of being the lead pastor here, and Nick really wanted to participate in meet and greet, so we swapped out on that last song there. We are starting a new series, and it's election week. Here's my political advice. Don't add to the anger. Nothing you can say on social media hasn't already been said. All we can do is show love, particularly across the aisle in a world that is convinced that if we don't agree, we can't get along. Don't demonize the other side. Seek love, understanding, and exhibiting the character of the Spirit. Sorry for being so political this morning. So now you know where I stand on exhibiting the character of the Spirit, which has come up in all the debates, right? So we're starting a new series. We're calling it Uncontroversial, because you're like, oh, well, we're going to talk about the things that we can all agree on. But there's a twist, because what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the things that we can all agree are really, really hard. And so we can all agree that these are difficult. So we can be uncontroversial about that. So here what I'm using is James chapter 1. James is a book written, we think, there's three Jameses in the Bible. There's James, brother of John. There's James, son of Alphaeus. So there's two James. If you watch The Chosen, that's big, and little James. But there's also a third James, which was Jesus' brother, who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And so most people think that it was him that wrote this book. There seems to be an authoritative nature about it. It seems very tied to a lot of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. So that's who they think wrote it. But here are the four things we're going to talk about from James chapter 1. All these super uncontroversial things. Having joy in suffering, avoiding temptation, being slow to speak and slow to anger, and actually doing what Jesus tells us. So, they're all uncontroversial because they're all really hard. Amen? All right, so this morning we're doing joy in suffering. So what I tried to do, I didn't have time, but I tried to make the chairs less comfortable so that you guys could rejoice in that. But I realized that there's a fine distinction between finding joy in suffering and finding joy in causing suffering. And so I needed to make sure that I was on the right track. This one's really hard because almost every profession that we might engage in as a work, or every dollar that we spend on ourselves, typically is in service to causing ourselves less suffering. You think about doctors, you think about mechanics, everybody's trying to make things a little bit easier. What are you spending money on? We want a more comfortable chair. We want an easier car to drive. We want everything. No one's like, hey, if I get this, it'll make my life a little harder, except workout equipment. We always want the most painful workout equipment, but everything else, we want life to be easier. And so it's hard for us to say we should find joy in suffering. Nobody wants that. In fact, I would say there's a huge industry in our country making us all believe that we're immortal, that nobody is thinking about death. Everyone wants to push death as far away as possible. We don't want to deal with that, and so we just don't. When Ecclesiastes says it's wise to spend time in funeral homes, that's a really weird thing to hear in our culture, where we can just keep extending life. And so that gets harder when we go into the church, where some strains of Christianity tell you that Jesus takes away all of your suffering in this life if you have enough faith in this life. And that's a lie, by the way. It's easy to see because Jesus promises disciples that they're going to go through hard times. The people that are most faithful to Jesus, that best understand his message, the ones that are out doing miracles in the Bible, he says, all of you are going to go through super hard times because of me. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because you follow Jesus, this life will be difficult. And if you don't follow Jesus, this life will be difficult. There's a guy named M. Scott Peck who wrote a lot of psychology books that kind of were popular level and not popular level. One of them was called The Road Less Traveled. I think it was from the 70s, but it's pretty famous book. He starts the book off by saying, life is hard. And he goes on to say, if we can come to terms with that, it'll make life easier. That if we expect it to happen, life is hard, then we can get there. And so let's see what James has to say this morning. Let's look at the first 8 verses of the book of James. James 1, verses 1 through 8. From James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are scattered outside the land of Israel, greetings. My brothers and sisters, think of the various tests you encounter as occasions for joy. Hold on, we'll stop right there. Other translations you've heard, it says, consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. I want to hear that pure joy. After all, you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance or patience. Let this endurance complete its work so that you may be fully mature, complete, and lacking in nothing. But anyone who needs wisdom should ask God, whose very nature is to give to everyone without a second thought, without keeping score. Wisdom will certainly be given to those who ask. Whoever asks shouldn't hesitate. They should ask in faith without doubting. Whoever doubts is like the surf of the sea, tossed and turned by the wind. People like that should never imagine they will receive anything from the Lord. They are double-minded, unstable in all of their ways. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. All right, so the NIV, like I quoted the NIV. One time when Audrey and I were first dating, we decided to memorize the whole first chapter. Actually, we were trying to memorize the whole book, but I think we made it to the first chapter of James. And so I have that one burned in my mind where it says, consider it pure joy when you face trials of many kinds. And so that pure joy makes it way more intense. It's like, not only can you find joy in hard times, it seems like they're saying it needs to be amazing. You just need to be so excited for all these terrible things in your life to happen. That seems to be what it seems to be saying, but I don't think we're going to go there because that seems to say we should be laughing maniacally when we're tortured. Like, that's where we're trying to go with our Christian faith. And, like, we wake up every morning and say, man, I hope something really bad happens today. Like, we don't do that, right? Nobody does that. And if you're like, well, that's because none of us are holy enough. Jesus sweated blood in the garden, asked God to take the cup away from it. If Jesus himself is not always joyful when things are hard, I think we're allowed to interpret this a little bit differently. Amen? All right. So maybe James is being a little overzealous here. Maybe the NIV translators were being a little overzealous here. And so I kind of like what it says here, occasions for joy in the CEB. And I think the only way this works is to see this as reflecting on it later or trying to find the goodness in the hardship. Because trials are trials. If you enjoy a hard time, it wasn't a hard time. That's just a conflict of terms there. But whatever we make of the first sentence, let's get to why he's talking about having joy in suffering. First thing he says that trials build patience and endurance. Trials build patience and endurance. We talked about the fruit of the Spirit for the last 8 weeks. Y'all patiently endured that sermon series. And what I found when I came to write this sermon series is that it kept tying into the stuff that we were supposed to demonstrate in the Spirit. If you've met someone who's never faced anything hard, you've never seen a grown-up whine. Like, you know that person that it's just like everything's been easy, and then all of a sudden, their pencil breaks, and all of a sudden they're just losing it. I think that's what happens. What makes parenting both frustrating and funny. Because the younger the kid is, the less it takes to make them cry about something ridiculous. Like, for instance, trying to take a pirate costume off of a small child when you have been through hard things, having to take off your pirate costume is not that big a deal. But if everything is like, the world could be something besides what I want it to be at that exact moment, you get impatient. And so this teaches us impatience. Each one of us is capable of enduring things because we've been through stuff. Little kids cry about the done things. I added the pirate one because that happened this morning, in case y'all saw my little 2-year-old, Captain Hook, who decided he's no longer Peter Pan. He's now Captain Hatton Hook. I think he's adding the hat word from the hat that he's wearing into the name Captain Hook. So he's Hatton Hook. So as we go through life, we'll face tough things. It'll make the little things not that important anymore. We'll realize that sometimes to get to where we want to get, we're going to sometimes stall out. We're going to sometimes go through hard times. Some people are not going to understand what we're trying to do. Some people are going to try to stand in our way, and we can expect it and not lose our minds when things get difficult. We'll have more patience. We'll learn that things take time. We'll learn that hard work sometimes pays off. Remember this, though. This is kind of an important thing about this whole message about joy and suffering is that trials don't always lead to perseverance and patience. For some people, a lot of people, trial leads to bitterness and despair. So you probably know somebody who's been through a whole lot, and they're the most amazing person you know because they can understand it, they can bear things patiently, they can walk you through their pain. But then you probably know other people who've been through a whole lot that now are the hardest people to be around. We have a choice to either grow from the things we go through or to get bitter about the things we go through. And so one of the beautiful things about Harry Potter, we're big Harry Potter fans in my house. You've got this kid, his parents die. He's forced to live under the stairs for 11 years. He's been through a whole lot of things, and he chooses to not always want to seek vengeance. He chooses to not always, he's a good character. And so you're thinking, trials make people morally good. But then you've got Voldemort, or plenty of other characters who have really, really hard lives, who it's the other way. They've experienced pain, they want to push pain on other people. And I think that's just a beautiful understanding of the complexity of human life, of the choices that we have to make, that we are affected by the things that we go through, but our life is not determined by the things that we go through. But we'll get to more about that later. What matters is what we do with the trial. What matters is what we do with the trial. Will we let it will we let it rob our joy, or will we let it make us better? Will we let it make us more patient? Then James says something even crazier. This takes a whole lot of Greek to understand what it's saying, and I'm going to give you that because you guys have endured patiently. Suffering makes us complete. Suffering makes us complete. That's a weird thing to say, right? You can't, the word complete, telos, could also be translated perfect. Suffering makes us perfect. Here's an even crazier thing. Paul said something even weirder. Paul said, not through James, in a different book, Paul says Jesus was perfected through suffering. That doesn't make any sense. Jesus was always perfect, right? He didn't sin. He was perfect. That's where the Greek comes in. So the word telos, T-E-L-O-S, like telescope, television, has to do with something going from here to there. It's achieving its goal. We're not trying to be perfect, as in like we never make any mistakes. We're trying to be who God made us to be. So we can say that Jesus was always perfect. He didn't sin, but he was perfected through suffering because he was achieving what God had for him. So when we go through hard times, God can use that to shape us to be the people he's called us to be. God uses suffering to shape us when we let him. It's kind of like if people went through a hard time in the military. Sometimes it breaks them. Sometimes they're able to minister to other soldiers. People who've experienced abuse can walk alongside other survivors. Even people who have done terrible stuff cause their own pain. They can walk through and help people to keep them from doing those same mistakes that they've done, or they can be destroyed by them. Everyone who has experienced loss can help others heal. It doesn't mean that God causes it, only that he uses it. Now, I kind of dropped that bomb in there, so I want to address that. When we're talking about suffering, a lot of people struggle with how do we have an all-knowing God? How do we have an all-loving God, an all-powerful God, and they're still suffering in this life? Now, I can't answer that question this morning, but I'll give you a piece of it that gives me peace when I go through hard things. So, does God cause suffering? If you focus on certain passages in the Old Testament, it's clear that sometimes God acts in judgment. But at the same time, in the Old Testament, you've got books like Job, books like Ruth, where people go through hard times, and it's not because they did anything wrong. It's just because life is hard, because the world is hard. And so, there's lots of suffering that doesn't happen because of judgment. And Jesus complicates it even further. There's this guy that's born blind in John 9, and the disciples are like, this guy was born blind. What we know from somebody's interpretation of the Old Testament is that if something bad happens to someone, it's their fault. But this guy was born blind, so is it because his parents did something wrong, or did he somehow sin in the womb, or God knew he was going to sin and went ahead and judged him ahead of time? And Jesus is like, no, it's not about that at all. It's about God's going to do something in this life. He doesn't really address that, but it's basically saying there's evil in this world. And I think a lot of times we like to use it must be God judging them so that we don't have to feel compassion for them. And so I've never seen a time where I can be like, oh, that's definitely God's judgment on someone's life. We are called to have compassion for them. And then when another thing I see is people start feeling that about themselves. They're like, well, I went through this hard time. It must be something that I did. And so not only are they going through the hard time, they're now heaping all this guilt on themselves. And I'm like, well, I know you, and I know other people that are way worse than you, and they're not experiencing this judgment, so it has to be random. And that's the way it looks, especially when you look at natural disasters. Judgment is justice if you get judged because of something you've done. But if it's random, if it's happening, innocent bystanders are being hurt, if it's not equal, like to what you did versus what someone else did for the same thing, it's random, and evil is random, and there's evil in this world, and that's where it's coming from. And so, but at the same time, he's an all-knowing, this strong God. Why isn't he stopping it? My only answer for this is, there's two answers. Number one, we're waiting for the final kingdom, that God can stop and do miracles. He can keep people from being hurt. And sometimes he steps up and enters our world and breaks the cause and effect of this life to do that. But at the same time, he's a God of love. And so he wants people to have a chance to make the choice to not do that. The only problem is if nobody gets the chance to cause evil, then everyone's just being controlled. And that's not the world God's trying to create, even though it causes so much pain. And so, as messy as that is, I don't know if that helps you through what it is, but I think it's a theology of how we can say we have an all-knowing, all-loving God in the midst of a broken and painful world. But what we do know is that this is a broken and painful world. So we can wrestle with why did God allow it, but at some point we just have to say, it's here, now we have to deal with it. And so we have a choice, whether you're a Christian or not, are we going to let the things we've been through break us, or are we going to let them heal us and change us into people? Because each one of us probably knows somebody who's, like I said, broken by evil, and other people who have become really strong people because of it, inside the faith and outside the faith. And so, get us back on track. We know that we're going to face trials in this life. Whether you believe God is who he says he is or not, we know people who are broken and bitter from trials. We know others became stronger. I've seen it in and out of the church. I just said that from memory, and then I just read it again to you guys. Sorry. But God wants to give you joy in your trials, give you patience, make you complete, make you whole, make you the person that you're called to be, to serve the purpose you're called to serve. So how do we do this? He goes into this next part, and I've always struggled with this as I've read this verse, and I think it's the first time I really understand it. We need wisdom. We need wisdom. The first 1,000 times I've read this chapter, I was always like, oh, well, he just randomly changed the subject. He went from suffering, and now he's like, well, you got joy in suffering. Oh, by the way, ask for wisdom. And I didn't realize that they were connected. Because if we're going to have joy in suffering, if we're going to have patience and endurance, if we're going to become complete, we have to have the wisdom to properly understand the things that we're going through. All right, so like I said, at first it seems like a non sequitur, but we need wisdom to understand our trials, to get stronger and be joyful. So ask God for wisdom. That's one of the things that we try to do it on our own. We're like, oh, well, I just need to find the silver lining. I just need to, see what God can teach me. This is all about having a conversation with God, letting the Spirit of God walk you through what you've been through. I've heard stories of people who have experienced terrible suffering, and they said, why, God? And God didn't answer them, but he gave them peace. So the answer for a lot of people is just connect with the Spirit of God, and he can get us through everything. Wrestle with your struggles with God. That's one of the huge parts of the book of Psalms I think we don't understand, because we sing a lot of happy songs. You look at the book of worship in the Old Testament, which is the book of Psalms, a third of them are saying all sorts of crazy stuff to God. Like, God, you walked away. God, where are you? God, why did you let this happen? God, I want you to beat up my enemies. Like stuff that we would never say in a prayer, except maybe in the third quarter of the Georgia-Florida game. But we're called to say that. So if you have a problem, go to God with it. Even if you know that it's not a fair reflection of who you think God's supposed to be, you're allowed to yell at God. I think everyone has permission to yell at God. Wrestle with them with others. Bring your pain to other people. Get wisdom from what they've been through. If you know you've been through something that someone else has been through, let them walk with you. Get counseling. I think sometimes counseling gets a bad rap in the church because you're like, oh, well, I'm not going to God, I'm going to counseling. Or they think, well, it seems disingenuous to pay someone to listen to my problems. But the thing is, a licensed counselor who's a good counselor can help you organize your thoughts around what you've been through to give you a better perspective. Whether they're being paid to do it or not, the reason we're paying them is so that they can do that to help us instead of, work at Kroger. Like, you want somebody who can say, hey, you're saying this, but did you think about this? And be able to put these pieces together and help people organize their thoughts so that we can get out of whatever spiral we're into. So I always recommend people go to counseling. But we got to address something in the passage that was kind of weird. Because again, like I said, it seems weird because all of a sudden he's like, have joy in suffering, be complete, get some wisdom. Oh, but you better not doubt, or else you get nothing. Did y'all catch that part of the verse? It ended on a really weird note, but I left it in there because it's in the Bible. What's this about being double-minded? James says, you can ask God. You don't have to earn it. God's going to give it to you. But if you doubt just a slice bit, you're going to get nothing. That's how it reads. Is that not what you saw? I don't know why it was like that, because we know that the guy came to Jesus. Jesus says, everything's possible for him who has faith. And the guy responded, I do believe, help my unbelief. So we can say that to God. If you're like, well, I'm asking God, and I'm struggling with having the faith of believing that God could do it, God says, well, ask me for faith too. Ask for wisdom. And you're like, I don't know if he's going to give me wisdom. Say, well, can I have faith too? He'll give you that too. All right? So I don't know why James is being so weird in this passage, but I want to address this wave thing. So he says, anyone who struggles, who's double-minded, is like a wave getting tossed about by the ocean. And N.T. Wright, in his commentary on this passage, gave a great explanation of this. We're talking about dealing with suffering. We're talking about dealing with pain, the trials that we go through. And of course, in this particular part of the Bible, most of the trials are persecution they're experiencing for being Christians. And he's saying you can have wisdom to understand this, or you can let it break you. And so think about what a wave is. A wave is basically this energy that moves across water because of some cause way over there. It has no control over where it's going. It has no control of what kind of damage it causes on the other side. So whatever we make of this whole faith, no faith, whatever, we don't want to be a wave. We don't want to be a wave. We can choose to let things happen to us and become who we are because of what things did to us. Or we can let things happen to us and we can get with God to get wisdom to become stronger because of it. That we don't just have to be pushed along by all the terrible things that have happened to us. That we are not determined by our past. We're affected by our past, but we are not determined by what we've been through. I'm using that word in the philosophical sense, deterministic, meaning you have no control over what happens next. And so we'll experience things outside of our control. We can be reactionary, or we can just let it push us into whatever we're becoming. We can let God give us wisdom, joy, and patience so that we can use even our worst experiences to become what God has set out for us. As we close this morning, each one of us has been through some tough things, things that we've done that brought problems, things that others have done, illness, death, loss, broken friendships, divorce, economic upheaval, constant stress, anxiety, depression, abandonment, whatever it is you've been through. Lots of us are dealing with stuff. Our God can walk us through that. I was listening this week to a podcast about this woman named Brenna Blaine, who has written this really intense book about her life experiences. And she had a dad that was a pastor who then had a big moral failing. And right after that happened and her parents got divorced, she got abused. And it just broke her. And she kept trying to run from God. And God kept showing up in crazy ways. She told us one story. She was with this friend who was also running from God. And she said, I keep hearing voices of someone saying, where are you? And someone walked up and said, I have this Bible verse I feel like I'm supposed to tell you. It's from Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve were running, and God's saying, where are you? And it just broke that girl, brought her to the Lord, and then she started experiencing these powerful things. But she struggles with bipolar disorder. And even as she was writing this book, she said she had to get hospitalized because she keeps having manic episodes that turn into depressive episodes, and she's wrestling with using medication. And from what I understand about bipolar disorder, it's really hard to want to use the medicine because you also get these really, really good high times. And so just wrestling. So she's experienced all this transformation. There was also a lot of fluidity. I'll use that word since I didn't preface, but back and forth with how she's lived her life and wrestling with those kinds of things, wrestling with her mental illness, but God has done so much in her life. And it's just this path of you keep coming to God. You let him change you, make you stronger, or it can break you. And it was just a really powerful story of exactly what I was talking about that I wasn't expecting to get as I was working on my sermon. The pain that you're going through right now is real. The pain that you're going through, the pain that you feel, the brokenness that you feel, it's okay. The tears and yelling at God are okay because it's part of the Bible. God says, do it. They memorized those passages and said, how long will you forget me? But we can choose joy. We can let God eventually give us peace, patience, kindness, and wisdom. Then we can have a better perspective. We can walk others through their pain. Then we can stop others from experiencing the same pain. You see what God can do with someone who's being transformed by what they've been through. God has you on the path to become complete. It wasn't like he saved you and now he's just going to watch you, run around in circles until you get to go to heaven when you die. He's got you on a path to become exactly what you were created to be, to bring light and blessing into this world. And you can't mess it up enough. You can't completely be like, I'm going to disqualify myself from anything God has for me. I know that's not true because I did some prison ministry, and the serial killer Wayne Williams was in there ministering to people. Like, you can mess things up as bad as you want, and there's still a chance for God to work in your life. Struggles of faith could take you there. You'll wrestle with that during our closing worship. As we sing this last song, as we take communion, ask for it for anyone who's suffering this morning. Ask that they can experience joy and peace and presence in the midst of it. Ask for joy and wisdom and patience in what you've been through. Ask for a miracle. Ask God to rescue you out of it, because he does that too. Trust God with that. And as we take communion, we celebrate the fact that God has pushed away all the distance between us. All the things that we've done, all the things that the world's done, keeps us separated from God. And he said, you don't have to come to me, I'm coming to you. And you can share a meal with me. And when you share a meal with God, not only do you get connected to God, you get connected to everyone else who's also sharing that meal. But at the same time, we believe that there's a power that comes into us that helps us live that life, that can give us joy in the midst of suffering, that can give us strength in the midst of trials. So let communion remind us of that as we go into a time of communion and continue worship.